Hello and welcome to the Scuttlebutt Podcast. I'm your host, Brock Briggs, and each week I bring you a conversation with a different current or former service member to talk about what we can learn from them. This is a place where we try to learn about anything and everything from histories and today's greatest vets. Today I'm talking with Caleb McMurtrey. Caleb, you are the foremost YouTube and Israel and Hamas expert, and we're going to get into a little bit of that today. But let's talk a little bit about your background, what gets you here in front of me today.
Yeah, I definitely don't know about expert. Still learning more every day. Just trying to relay what I learned, but I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. A little bit about my background: commissioned into the reserves back in 2020. So still baby in the career journey, but I've been learning a lot along the way from more of a high level. I'm a logistician, but I've been getting to do some civil affairs stuff. So that's been a good time. On the civilian side, cybersecurity by trade, working a little bit on my way out of more the technical grind, but I've been on YouTube since 2020. Started off making cybersecurity content, and then I pivoted last year, or at the end of last year, early this year, to my personal channel talking about current events, international security, and international relations topics. That's always been something that I've been incredibly passionate about and that I've followed closely, but I haven't really produced any content or talked openly about it. And so it's like a fun space to scratch that itch and get into making videos and stuff. I've really fallen in love with YouTube while making the cybersecurity content. So it's been a great time.
There is nothing that will quite get you up to speed about what you know about a topic than trying to make informational content, specifically a video about a certain subject. That is for sure. I don't know how many times I've really thought that I've had a well-informed opinion and ideas about things and gone to try to teach or talk about it to somebody. And then I'm like, I actually have no idea what I'm talking about here. So the fact that you have been covering the Israel and Hamas stuff just over the last month or so intently, I know that you've spent your time researching it and getting into the nitty gritty. I'd love to maybe kick this off and I don't want to say necessarily start from the beginning, but from a high level, as you've been starting to cover this conflict unfolding, what have been like your high level takeaways from what has unfolded so far?
That's a great question. It's like a tough one because I'll take something away and then a week later, I feel like I have to throw it out the window because it's just been so back and forth. The dynamic of the situation has just been so interesting because it doesn't fall into the typical lines that you would normally associate. Like it's not necessarily like a state on state war. I feel like with Russia, Ukraine, it's easy to go back to large scale combat operations, which is a huge topic in the military now, trying to move away from counterinsurgency, prepare for near peer war. But in this situation, you might have large scale combat operations, but at the same time, you're fighting counterinsurgency. And so having to balance the two simultaneously for a country like Israel, that's obviously an incredibly difficult thing to ask of any military. And they're having to figure this out on the fly. One of the initial huge takeaways was just how shocking it was that the attacks on October 17th could have happened, that it happened at all. The scale and sophistication of the attack really, I think, says a lot. A lot of prior planning had to go into that kind of thing. And the fact that none of that was like picked up at any point by intelligence or by Israeli intelligence, it's a bit of a head scratcher, but certainly that'll be a deeper conversation for another day. But the response for the IDF going into Gaza, I think that's the next big takeaway is what does urban warfare in the 21st century look like? We saw a little bit about what it looks like during the war against ISIS, Aleppo, Mosul, and Damascus. You see some huge like urban battles, force on force, or multiple sides fighting at the same time against each other. But this is going to be a bit of a beast for the IDF to take down. I've seen some figures that Hamas has upwards of 20 to 30,000 fighters, 300 miles of tunnelage under the Gaza Strip. So they can move fighters and equipment and supplies in and out of Gaza City, which the IDF when we're recording, they've cordoned off. They can move in and out of the city at will and get to the southern end of the strip to resupply, rest, get back into the fight. And so that's just going to be such a huge challenge for the IDF to be able to tackle, especially if they're going to make good on the objective that they've set forth to comprehensively destroy Hamas.
Those are some like really important points, and you aptly say this is still so early and very well. This could be the beginning of a much longer conflict, and things are just almost changing by the minute. And I think that's why it's important. I have a ton of respect and appreciation for what you're doing because it's the coverage of this is like necessary and lots of different viewpoints and getting information out there. I think what we ought to do before we get into maybe the first initial attacks and work chronologically forward is maybe start with kind of defining who the players are in this. We know we've got Israel and Hamas. Who are they and like why is that important? And then maybe tie in how these other players, we've got Hezbollah, we've got all these other surrounding countries and nations that kind of have a vested interest in this fight. This isn't just, a small isolated thing, and there are like going to be some major repercussions that easily draw in the surrounding countries into this incident, including us. So, yeah, maybe let's start with talking about just like defining our terms. Who are we working with? And we'll take it from there.
Sure. Of course, the term you throw there is vested interest. That kind of makes this so sticky and potentially more complicated at a regional level. But to start, of course, Israel, I think everybody at this point knows the country of Israel, that they're there. And then you have Hamas, which is an organization that formed in the late 1980s in the Gaza Strip, forming as a response to the Israeli occupation of really the land of Israel, which they see as the land of Palestine. And Hamas has risen in power substantially over the last 20 years. In 2006, they won a series of elections in the Gaza Strip. And so they've been like the governing body in the Gaza Strip since then. They are they're a kind of large militant organization. They've got a large armed wing known as the Al-Qassam Brigades. Again, like I mentioned earlier, believed to have upwards of like 30,000 fighters, somewhere around like 30,000 rocket systems, very crude systems. They have a relationship to Iran, which we'll talk about here in a minute. So they've received some funding and equipment and training from Iran, but a lot of it is really just like living off of the land, producing weapons. And they've published videos of producing weapon systems out of pipelines and out of just things that you find in an urban environment. And it's really clever that the way, that they've done this and turned themselves into a pretty equipped fighting force, especially for an urban area like that. To the north, you've got Hezbollah operating out of southern Lebanon. Similar kind of story. They formed sometime in the 80s, the mid 80s. And they also are formed as a response to the Israeli occupation in southern Lebanon at the time. And they identify as a resistance front against Israel. Difference between them and Hamas, a couple differences. One, Hezbollah is much, much larger. They might have I've seen some estimates as low as 40,000 fighters. They claim to have a strength of 100,000, which that's the only time you're going to see that claim, right? That number thrown out. Some other guesses could be 60,000. I think 60 is the highest estimate that I saw that appeared somewhat credible, right? But either way, you're already looking at potentially twice the size of Hamas. But that's scratching the surface. They also have, in terms of rocket artillery, I've seen some estimates between 100,000 to 150,000 rocket systems, which is substantial, especially whenever you're talking about fighting against Israel, where they're like one of their signature defense systems is the Iron Dome, which for those that don't know, it's what they use to intercept indirect fires, rocket artillery, missiles, stuff like that. And so if you're going to beat that, you have to just saturate, just launch as many as you can because they can't intercept everything. So whenever you have 150, then you can keep saturating a target over time, and that becomes incredibly punishing. So Hezbollah is there. They've had a very close relationship to Iran since really inception, and they have received a lot of funding and training with the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, which is like the arm of the Iranian military that really is like, I'd say, using the term customer facing, the customers being militant groups. And so they're that arm that kind of goes out and interfaces with those groups, and they're more the asymmetric arm. To the northeast of Lebanon, you've got Syria. which we got to note because they're also allied to Iran. They facilitate the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah. Whenever Israel is trying to disrupt that relationship or disrupt logistics between Hezbollah and Iran, they're often attacking Syria. In fact, the past month, we've seen a lot of airstrikes coming out of Israel towards the Damascus airport, the Aleppo airport, targeting different logistics nodes within Syria. And they're really largely targeting the infrastructural capability or infrastructural capacity, rather, for Iran and Hezbollah to link up and share equipment. Of course, further east, you've got throughout Iraq and in Syria, a series of groups that this kind of ties in. This forms an umbrella called the Axis of Resistance. And it's the series of militant groups across the Middle East, includes the Houthis in Yemen, who have been fighting a war against Saudi Arabia here for a bit. You've got Hamas, Hezbollah, they all fall under this umbrella, the Axis of Resistance. They're not completely synced up. They still have some degree of agency. If you watch like the recent speech from Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, he claims that Iran and Hezbollah had no idea that Hamas was planning its attack. That could be true. That might not be true. But if it is true, then that's evidence that they're tied together, but they still have some degree of autonomy. But the reason I make that distinction of autonomy is because they are the hand holding the balloon strings is the IRGC in Iran. And so that's been that at the heart of it is Iranian influence in the region, the Iranian capacity to project power throughout the Middle East and to influence different groups. And so that's where this whole conflict gets a lot more complicated, because it's not necessarily just an Israel-Hamas war. You could chalk this up as a potential Israel-Iran proxy war. And Iran's got so many proxies. The axis of resistance geographically and militarily is pretty large. And Iran could definitely opt to escalate and involve more members. We've seen a lot of attacks on American military bases in Iraq and Syria over the past month. And it seems like those are ramping up. But that could be it could potentially be worse if Iran chose to continue to escalate and involve more groups in the fight and to try to apply pressure on the United States, either disincentivize us from getting involved or to punish American forces from being involved. But kind of rough sketch, those are the groups in the area.
Is there like a single uniting reason why everybody in this area hates Israel, or does it solely stem from the fact that they're all, maybe Iran is the puppet master pulling the strings on these other groups with money, weapons, funding, training, whatever else it is? Does it come back to the fact that it's that sole source of funding this kind of dissent, or are there unique reasons why each of these subgroups or affiliated groups doesn't like Israel?
Yeah, that's a really good question with a very complicated answer. And I know we hate nuance in 2023. Definitely money helps and influence helps. When looking at this situation, you've got to just be objective about it and look at it for what it is. A lot of folks have felt wronged by Israel, like folks in the Gaza Strip, folks in the West Bank, Palestinians who have been living there for a long time, their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, all have bad things to say about Israel because they've had bad things done to them by Israel. And so money might help, obviously, incentivize them to join Hamas or join the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Sorry, that's another group next to Hamas. But that might incentivize them to pick up arms, but they may not even need that because they've seen that family history of what has been done to them by what they see as an occupation force. Some of the rhetoric kind of describes that Israel isn't even legitimate. Of course, a lot of the rhetoric describes that Israel is not legitimate, but some of it describes that Israel is like a foreign entity. It's a foreign occupation force that's not even, they have no right to the land that they occupy. And they're really like a puppet of, say, the United States, right? That's like a lot of the rhetoric that you'll see out of Iran. And so it's like a mix of both, right? Some of it's an Iranian or kind of a wider desire to reclaim the land of Palestine and get rid of the Israeli state. But a lot of it, especially more for Palestinians in the area, is an airing of grievances over decades of deteriorating conditions, poor treatment by the Israeli government. And you can't really divorce that history from the wider picture because it does matter.
It's interesting how things can be quiet for so long, and then when things finally start popping off, literally and metaphorically, there, the all of the grievances just rise to the top about like it's just we've been on a slow, had the boiler on low for a while, and then that an attack brings all of that stuff to the surface. You were saying that there wasn't evidence or intel about the initial attack. Let's maybe jump into what that initial attack looked like and how the following events and the response has looked to meet that conflict.
Yeah, so this is where it looks particularly malicious, not just because the attack itself was so malicious, but because of what I personally kind of view is what it was designed to provoke. So on October 7th, sometime in the morning, about somewhere around 1,500 Hamas fighters went across the border with Gaza into Israel using paragliders. And simultaneously, there was a large rocket barrage going out of Gaza and into Israel. And that was like a feint to cover the infiltration of these groups, right? And the fighters got into nearby towns. There's a music festival that's become infamous in this whole thing. And they seized these towns. They killed civilians. They kidnapped civilians. They hit a military outpost right on the border and wiped it out. They took upwards of, I think, 200 hostages, if I remember right. It might be lower than that, but a lot of hostages, and pulled them back into Gaza. They pulled some of the bodies, pulled them back into Gaza. The accounts from the towns that they occupied are horrifying. I don't know if you want me to go into detail on that for this on the channel. Maybe I'm going to stay away from it just unless you want me to, but the kind of stuff that would provoke anybody to respond pretty significantly. If we're talking, it's already the deadliest day in Israeli history, at least since the day it was founded in 1947. I should say modern Israeli history, right? And so that provokes a huge response. If we were to go per capita between the attacks on October 7th and say 9/11, this would be like 30 9/11s. But instead of it being planes, it being people walking through lower Manhattan, butchering people, which is just an inherently traumatizing event, understandably. Following the attack, Israel completely blockaded the Gaza Strip and completely shut off humanitarian aid, just almost like a medieval level siege, cutting water, electricity, food, everything from going in and out of the Strip. And then the initial objective that was set forward and that they've reinforced has been, Israel's going to destroy Hamas once and for all. And they've had to hedge that by saying, we understand there's hostages and we understand that there are civilians, but our number one objective is to destroy Hamas. They've fought enough wars against Hamas. This attack was bad enough. They're ending it. And this past week, what we've seen is they've begun their ground operation into Gaza. And this could take several months for them to complete this, if not longer. And it's fuzzy to project out what that even is going to look like. There have been some discussions, which we can talk about at some point, but that's what they've been doing since. As for Hamas, their response has been, we're ready. They believe that they are ready for this fight. The attack that they did was pretty well planned and executed. And we're going to see how their defense has been planned and how they execute the defense. We named all those groups before. Of course, they're not oblivious to everything that's going on. Hezbollah has been engaged in this low-level conflict along the northern border of Israel. That's like that next domino to fall, if you will, on if Hezbollah chooses to get engaged, because of course they have that massive fighting capacity that we've already talked about. But that is an indicator that Iran's willing to step up the fight a little bit, because they not only are they much bigger than Hamas, but they're much closer to the IRGC. That's where it's been. I mentioned earlier, we've seen some attacks on American facilities in Iraq and Syria, but it's all eyes on Gaza and then like several eyes on northern Israel.
Israel's in such a difficult position with this, and you highlight this in one of your videos, calling it a lose situation for Israel. You talk about Gaza, that whole area is incredibly dense with people. Like it is chock full of non-militant people. And so it seems to me, and maybe chime in here, is Hamas using the fact that it is so densely populated as like a defense mechanism of they're holding everybody hostage, not even literally holding hostages, but they're holding the whole Gaza Strip hostage as to why Israel just can't come in with either an aerial attack that's like a massive blow or just basically level the entire area. Is that kind of how you're viewing or thinking about that?
Yeah, and that's like it's all bad. It's all bad, and it's just depressing. But one of the worst things to look at is just the civilian impact of this whole thing. Gaza, if it were a country and it were statistically tracked in this way, it would be the fifth most densely populated country in the world. It's 25 miles in length. Around Gaza City, it's only 3.5 miles in width. And down in the south, it's only 7.5 miles in width. That is not a lot of land area, especially whenever we're talking about things like rocket and missile artillery. That goes a heck of a lot farther than the size of Gaza. And Hamas, I don't necessarily think that Hamas can necessarily lose in this situation because they've got tunnels and they can just keep fighters in tunnels. That grants them mobility, that grants them protection, that grants them a psychological ability. Against the IDF, they can strike anywhere at any time. So it's a game of whack-a-mole, but instead of it just being like a nice kid's game of whack-a-mole, it could be a guy with an RPG. And that's nightmarish. That's how do you plan for that militarily, except to just go incredibly slow? And politically, we don't like things to go slowly, especially in war. We want it done quick. And especially internationally, Israel has been receiving a lot of pressure to implement a ceasefire, to slow down things, to not fully invade the Gaza Strip. If they're going to destroy Hamas, how do you do that without, taking over the Gaza Strip and handling the tunnels? And that's going to be incredibly costly. You're going to have soldiers executing that task. That's going to take a lot of time, and that's going to take a lot of soldiers going through doing the job against Hamas fighters that they see that this is their time. They're fighting for their people. They're fighting for their land. They're fighting against the great evil that they know. So it's a motivated enemy. It's a well-prepared enemy. And and the longer that this takes, Israel is going to continue to take criticism. The civilians have nowhere to go. They can't go into the tunnels. They can't go south to Egypt. There's not a lot they obviously can't go into Israel. There's not a lot of land area inside Gaza on the surface to go to. And so they're fleeing bombs, they're fleeing gunfire, they're fleeing everything. And not a lot of humanitarian aid is going in. I saw yesterday that Israel's agreed to a 4-hour stand down daily to allow for humanitarian efforts to take place. You got to consider that logistical aspect of, okay, what is that actually going to look like and how is that going to be executed? Because that's a 4-hour window that Hamas could throw a wrench in. And then look, it's Israel's fault. They couldn't even maintain their own 4-hour ceasefire. So it's an incredibly complicated task that Israel has ahead of them. And there's not a lot of ways that they can do it and not look terrible doing it.
You also touched on that in one of the videos as well, and maybe let's zoom out here and talk about that criticism that Israel is getting. Well, how is the rest of the world perceiving this, and what is the response and feelings about Israel? How are those kind of unfolding? I know that there's a lot of interesting things happening in the news, at least within the U.S., talking about very anti-Israel sentiment coming out from a lot of particularly young people in the United States. I know that Hamas and like several of these other organizations that you're using that you've mentioned here today are talking on social media and like news channel outlets, basically damning Israel, pointing to them as the bad guy in this whole thing. I think you've laid out a good case here as to why it's a super difficult situation. So maybe just at a high level, how is the rest of the world kind of taking this, and what can we take away from that?
Yeah, and that's like you point out, Hamas and some other groups have been operating on social media, and so the information space has been fascinating to watch because I feel like you just see it plain as day who's receiving information from where. So at a high level, the United States, most other Western countries are showing support for Israel. Obviously, the U.S. has very publicly sent a couple aircraft carrier strike groups to the Mediterranean to deter Hezbollah and other groups from getting involved. Some other European actors have also sent some degree of aid or forces to reinforce that statement. But at a social level, you get more evidence of kind of the Palestinian narrative, right? If we want to call it that, right? And it ties back to what I said earlier about the motivations for somebody from like the West Bank to fight Israel being different from somebody from like Iraq, right? Whereas like in Iraq, you might be incentivized through money or through an allegiance to Iran. Somebody from the West Bank might be incentivized because they've seen their family be wronged by the Israeli government over time. And that's a message that has been, famous phrase to describe Gaza up to this point, probably now as well, is open air prison. That's not a good thing. You don't want to live in an open air prison, and that's not necessarily going to incentivize you to not view, if you're in Gaza, view the Israelis as the prison guards and as the group that's keeping you in there. And so that's lens that has been projected outward of look at what Israel has done to us and what we have had to do in response. So it's actually gotten to the point where, where if you're pro-Israeli, you might see the October 7th attacks as just a senseless act of butchery, which frankly is what it is. It is, but you could justify it. I say it. I'm trying to analyze this from the lens, right? The lens is trying to justify that as look at how bad Israel has treated Palestinians. That is the response. They felt that they had no other way out than to do something like that. And now in response to that, Israel has launched a month-long air campaign killing thousands of civilians. They've implemented a humanitarian blockade so the civilians have no relief. And now they're launching a ground invasion. Again, PR disaster, right? Especially if you're not really resisting that in the information space, at least effectively amongst young people and on social media. So that's what the response has looked like online. It's been depressing. It's been fascinating. I feel like that's one of those things that anybody watching that gets fascinated by information operations, this is one of those things that is going to be studied for a long time. How is it that something as senseless as October 7th could be not only justified, but viewed as heroic and something that you could cast on Israel for?
There is a massive psychological element to this too, and like the kind of a lot of people trying to pull the wool over other people's eyes in terms of what is actually going on and what's at stake here. And oddly enough, or maybe not so oddly, this sort of information and kind of narrative pushing like really resembles a lot of the early sentiment about our involvement in the Middle East with the GWAT. Like our early before ISIS and before all of that, it was about our airstrikes and how the United States is killing innocent civilians in Afghanistan and all of this stuff. But it's look at the circumstances of what's happening here. It's people are using, like I said, hostage may not be the right word, but our enemies, and in this case, Israel's enemies, are using other people to get in the way so that they can hide. And what is the appropriate military response? Don't do anything and just let them continue to make these attacks, and which they probably will continue. Maybe they do attack and maybe this next phase here, we can talk about what's happening today, what's going on. But then that also they're under intense scrutiny for how that attack transpires, and of course, everybody wants to armchair or quarterback a military operation, a super complex one, and then on top of that, as soon as they make like a serious attack, they open themselves up as vulnerable, And I feel like that may even be the next layer on top of that is they go to charge in there to take Gaza back, and Hezbollah and all these other organizations, maybe they think, okay, this is now our time. They're weak and it's time to make a move.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's why I titled that "Lose Lose" because it really feels like it's a catch-22. You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. If you do, if say Israel does go in, which they have, that probability that they're accidentally going to hurt some innocent people rises drastically. But if they don't, like you said, then the probability of there being follow-on attacks rises drastically. So you're screwed in either direction. I think that's one reason why Israel has publicly stated that their number one focus is Hamas, and they're going to try to limit civilian casualties, but they're not going to not target Hamas to protect civilians, which as an American is like crazy to hear. But if you look at it through this conversation that we've discussed, it's conceivable to see how you can get to that point. If you are objective oriented and you need to win, and if it's a war for state survival, then that's where you go. Like you crush the enemy, and it sucks that there's people in between. You got to get the enemy or you lose, and you cannot afford to lose. So there's that phrase that Israel cannot afford to lose a single battle. It's in reference to their tiny geographic size, and they're just surrounded by people that hate them. And so, yeah, they have to win. They cannot lose.
That conversation brings to light the threat or idea of Israel being a nuclear state. What have been your observations or understanding about the possibility of that being invoked? Because just putting myself in Israel's shoes here, if I'm on the verge of thinking that I'm going to be completely wiped off the face of the earth, I'm probably call it in the last ditch effort. So, what have kind of your thoughts been on that?
Yeah, that hasn't really been in like the public discussion as much. I think it's just because they're fighting non-state actors. I feel if Iran were to conventionally get involved and like formally declare war, that would probably be one of those cases that they're just not going to bother. They're just going to lob a nuke at Iran. And that is complete speculation, I should say. And again, I'm not an expert. I'm just going from what I've read and learned so far. But in terms of fighting Hamas and Hezbollah, they're conventionally Israel's like position that they can fight and win those wars. It's really just a matter of doing it in a way that they're not going to kill too many civilians along the way, and they're not going to accidentally or tied to that threat on civilian casualties provoke wider reaction in the Arab world to respond against Israel.
So, where does that bring us up to today? You've stated that they have entered Gaza and are making kind of an advancement on that. Where do we sit as of today?
Yeah, Israel's obviously launched their ground invasion. It was like a gradual scale up. We first started to see raids in and out of Gaza to set the battlefield. Now they're in. And so they've completely separated Gaza City from the southern half of the Gaza Strip. Leading up to the fight, and even today, they've been trying to get Israeli or get Palestinians in Gaza Strip to move south to the southern half of the Gaza Strip and away from Gaza City, and likely to just clear the battlefield so they can just shoot and know that it's Hamas that they're shooting at. That's been another part of that information battlefield where it doesn't look like that really succeeded. Hamas told a lot of Palestinians, don't go, that's disinformation, you're perfectly safe. The battlefield still has a lot of civilians, a lot of refugees, not sure where they need to go. And Israel has cut off Gaza City from the southern half of Gaza. They're also pushing southward to both the northwest and the northeast part of the strip. And it looks like they're really going for just a complete isolation of Gaza City. And we're just going to have to see how they choose to clear the city and whether or not they choose to go southward and clear the rest of the strip. That is where we are today.
Another thing that you had highlighted in the Lose video, and I'm gonna include a link to that in the show notes so people can go and read up on your kind of more in-depth analysis of this. But you highlighted the threat of how refugees, like Hamas, could be embedding with refugees and why that's like a pretty substantial threat. Can you maybe get into what that might look like and possibilities for Hamas if Israel comes in and is able to quote unquote take back the city, what does that look like for them and kind of potential fallout where maybe this actually doesn't get resolved?
Yeah, again, it's like Hamas can play this on their terms. It's their home field, and they've got a massive tunnel network to facilitate that fight. And they've got civilians all over the place, like you said. So they can, if, say, IDF bombs a building, believing that under that building there's a Hamas tunnel. Maybe there is, but maybe there also happens to be a bunch of civilians in that building. That becomes an information win and a propaganda win for Hamas, because look at how Israel just killed a bunch of civilians. Hamas, IDF, imagine going there, they're going room to room, building by building, street by street, clearing the buildings, trying to identify Hamas tunnels, rocket firing positions, all these things. And there's civilians in the way. And Hamas fighters just pops out in the crowd, shoots some rounds, and runs back. A lot of these IDF servicemen that are going in, servicemen and women, a lot of them are reservists that were only called up a month ago. And so as a reservist, you get some training, but it's also, you're not the full-time people. And so there is like a difference in targeting discipline until you've been immersed in it long enough. You know what I mean? And so that a lot of that puts a dilemma on the IDF, where if any mistake that they make can be exploited by Hamas. And basically the IDF has to play as perfect a game as they can, to use kind of crude ball game language, right? If they don't, then again, it becomes an information win for Hamas. It takes down morale of IDF troops. It opens up attack opportunities for Hamas. And in an urban environment against a force of 30,000 that can just appear out of nowhere, that's a real dilemma.
We've obviously are still like very early in this. Hopefully not. Hopefully we are closing in on some a meaningful win against the threat. However, I think that you laid out a really good case of to why this might be a much, much bigger conflict and could drag out for a very long time. You have said that one of the things to watch for is going to be to see if Iran or any of these other groups that you had mentioned get involved. Are there other things that you think about as indicators that we need to be watching for in terms of, hey, this might explode or get into an even bigger predicament than it is currently?
Yeah, apart from the levels of involvement and engagement by, say, Hezbollah, I'd throw the Houthis in there a little bit. Again, they have their own agency, but the Houthis have already declared war on Israel, for instance. What are they going to do? But you get the picture, right? Apart from the kind of their level of involvement, it'd probably be the humanitarian crisis. Because again, that's something that can be exploited by Iran. Look at how bad the situation is. Look at how badly the Israelis persecuted them before the war. Now that the war's happened, look at how bad they're treating them. Somebody has to do something. Oh, look, here we are. We can do something. You know what I mean? And it has to be resolved from just a general human perspective. You can't let that go on for too long anyway. If it's going to happen, you have to resolve it as quick as possible. But there are advantages for Iran and for some of the other actors that may wish to escalate things, to drag it out, to make it as bad as possible, and make Israel look as bad as they possibly can. Maybe that will lead to political shifts in the West, and Israel will be stripped of some of the levels of support that it's received. And maybe some of the Arab countries in the area will not don't necessarily support them right now. Maybe they'll choose to also support some of the anti-Israeli factions in the area. If you consider before the war, Israel was very close to normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia, which would have been a tectonic shift in the region. And now those talks are effectively frozen. They could pick up after the war, but if a humanitarian crisis is so bad, then perhaps Saudi Arabia just doesn't pick those talks up. And that's a complete political setback for everybody, frankly, in the region. So, and that, of course, benefits Iran and Saudi Arabia are not friends. And so it's incredibly complicated. There are a lot of motivations. And unfortunately, and this is like, again, the worst part of the whole thing, Palestinian people are stuck at the bottom of it. And it's just crap. Like There are bombs falling on them. There's nowhere to go. And there's incentives from some of the groups to make their misery as bad as humanly possible. So that's why at the end of the day, Palestinians have to be the ones that are handled and treated properly as much as possible so that this thing can really end for good.
I know we're not here to completely guess as to what's going on, but just from your time spent over the last month analyzing the conflict, let's put on our speculation hat here for a second and think about what is it that you are thinking is going to happen in terms of just, you said, I'm not going to hold you to this is just pure speculation here from for a moment, but what is it that you're thinking about how this is going to play out and maybe other events to kind of unfold from here?
I could go a couple different directions. I really like to opt, generally speaking, on, oh, it's going to de-escalate at some point. People don't really want to fight. And sooner rather than later, the whole thing's going to shut down. And that would be phenomenal if that were the case. I don't necessarily get the vibe that Israel's about that. Israel's really on that path. So if I were to speculate again, just could completely fall out the window tomorrow. I know Hezbollah is giving a speech on November 11th. They could imagine they just declare war tomorrow, and then everything I say right now falls out the window. But I would imagine realistically that Hamas just fights to the last man. It's a terrible fight in Gaza, and it looks really bad on Israel. But after some amount of months or a year, then the fighting's over, and then Hamas is destroyed. And Hezbollah chooses not to get involved. Maybe Hezbollah maintains a low-level conflict, but they ultimately don't get involved because Iran doesn't want to sacrifice Hezbollah as well. Really, nobody in Lebanon wants a war. And so Hezbollah would really be acting pretty plainly against the will of the people that they claim to represent, which would not be great for them. And then Iranians don't want war. And so they would also be going very plainly against the will of their people. And so I really get the vibe that everybody generally wants the temperature to decrease a little bit, but for political reasons, they'll keep the pressure on. But again, who knows? If the fight goes on too long with Hamas, there's always that probability that bad things are going to happen to innocent people. And there comes a point maybe where either Hezbollah or Iran decide that they've had enough and it's time to get involved. And this is the time. This is the time we put the cards on the table and we go after it. It really could go either way. But again, for all I know, tomorrow Israel comes out and says, okay, we've done it. We've killed their leadership and we're calling it good for today.
Is there anything that we haven't gotten into that you think is pertinent for the layman who isn't studying this every day and analyzing the conflict, staying up with all the news? Anything else pertinent that you think we should cover to stay as informed as possible?
Yes, but that's like another hour and a half, 2 hour conversation. Because like all things international relations, it impacts everything, right? It's a wave. So if something happens in one part of the pool, everyone's going to get some part of it, right? Obviously, the war in Ukraine didn't end, and Ukraine could really continue to use the support that it's received at this point with aid being routed towards Israel. There's that open question, does that impact aid to Ukraine? And what does that war look like if this war goes on a lot longer, if this war expands? How does that impact not only Russia's ability to fight in the war, how does that impact Ukraine's ability to fight in the war? And then, of course, big topic, as always, is China-Taiwan. Fighting in a dense urban area, Taiwan has dense urban areas. What lessons do the Chinese pull from this fight that they might feel like they need to take in before they do anything in Taiwan, should they choose to do so? A lot of eyes are looking at this conflict, not just from the West, a lot from Moscow and a lot from Beijing. And the lessons that are learned in this fight, similar to the lessons being learned in Ukraine, will influence the next war. Again, I'm scratching the surface and opening a can of worms that I don't think we really have time to cover, but maybe that's a teaser for next time.
That's absolutely a teaser for next time. It is very clear to me that there is just the implications of this are huge. Like you said, even if Israel comes out tomorrow and says, hey, we've got their leadership and this fight is over. Like you said, the learnings, how people have responded, everybody's taking notes right now. And I understand that we're over there. We've got kind of an ongoing presence in there. It's a big brother if anything pops off, but a lot of our enemies they're viciously paying attention to try to figure out how they can gain an edge. Caleb, I really appreciate you taking some time to break this down, and we'll definitely have to have you back as maybe more things unfold or maybe even on a different topic to expand on. Where can we go to follow you? Got the YouTube channel. If you want to plug that, I'll be sure to include a link in the show notes, but maybe say that and anywhere else people can stay up with you.
Sounds good. Thank you for having me on again. I love talking about international relations and security. So this has been a blast for me, and I really appreciate it. And I'm humbled that you wanted to talk to me about this stuff. You can find me on Twitter. Caleb B. McMurtrey is my handle. And then on YouTube at Caleb McMurtrey. Twitter, I talk about more than just international relations stuff. I'm a big football nerd, diehard Chiefs fan. So I'm kind of all over the place there. But if you want just security and international relations stuff, then the YouTube channel's there. So that's where I'm at.
Awesome. Caleb, I appreciate your time, man. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. Your listenership helps me better educate people like you and the rest of our nation's military, both past and present, on building a successful life outside of military service. If you're looking for more ways the top vets are leading more effective lifestyles, building businesses, and using the resources designed specifically for you, press here for a selection of some of the best clips. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date, and I will be talking with you soon.